Hello, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Rick Byros. I'm the president and owner of Innovative Publishing Company, which is the parent company of MedTech Intelligence. And I'll be your host for today's MedTech Intelligence virtual event. The title is Launch Medical Devices to Markets in the EU versus the US. And it is sponsored by Matrix Requirements. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. You are listening in using GoToWebinar's web-based broadcast system using your computer's speaker system by default, and there are no call-in numbers. If you have problems with the audio, please try to increase your computer's volume. If you are having audio issues, please log out and try to reconnect. Please contact Veronica Allen via the chat box to let her know if you continue to have sound issues. Today's event will consist of a 45 to 50-minute presentation by our speaker, followed by a Q&A period. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing in your questions into the chat pane on the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session after the presentation. You will be able to participate in a couple of interactive polls that will appear on your screen, and we encourage that you participate. There are no handouts for today's webinar, but you will receive an email with a link to the recording from Matrix Requirements in about 48 hours. Now, let me introduce our speaker for today. Today's speaker is Anne van Kronkelsveen, who is the RAQA manager for Matrix Requirements. Anne is a driven and dynamic RAQA professional who thrives on new challenges and making a positive impact on the world. With a PhD in bioengineering, she has always been fascinated by the intersections of science, innovation, and business. After years of honing her skills in regulatory affairs and quality assurance, Anne has become a true master, often lecturing at École Polytechnique de Louvain. Currently, RAQA manager at Matrix Requirements, Anne is a trailblazer who never settles for the status quo. She's passionate about helping customers and businesses succeed with regulatory affairs and quality assurance, and firmly believes that improvement of the quality system and implementation of regulations need to stay practical in order to be successful. And with that introduction, I'd like to turn things over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Rick, and welcome everybody. So as Rick already mentioned, I'm currently working for Matrix Requirements, but before I was also active in both smaller companies as well as multinationals. And we were targeting multiple markets around the world. So not only US and EU, but also other markets. So I'm really happy to talk to you today about how to build a regulatory strategy when you are going to focus on multiple markets, and in this case, the US and the EU. So on the agenda for today is to discuss common pathways, the similarities and the differences between bringing a product to the medical device to the market in the EU and in the US. And how to build or what to focus on when we are thinking about building a regulatory strategy in order to also do that in the most efficient way, avoiding double work and making it as smooth as possible. But before I want to get started, I would like to do a poll, as mentioned, where I'm wondering for the participants, who thinks that entering the US market at this moment is more difficult than the EU market, or is the EU market more challenging, or are both equal? Because in the past, actually, at least in a European perspective, the US was considered to be a more difficult market to enter with medical devices. And that had several reasons. One of them was that there were, or we had the feeling that there were more requirements, more strict requirements. There was this fear of inspections by FDA, that ID, that there was a possibility that they would shut down the company if the non-compliances were too big or too many. So European companies would focus on the European market first, and once they got the CE marking, they would consider the US market. Since the change from the medical device directives in Europe to the medical device regulations in 2017, that perception changed, because there was a lot of insecurities that entered the market. I mean, we had a new regulation, new requirements, both on notified bodies as well as on manufacturers, different requirements coming from the legislation, a whole adaptation period for all parties involved. So at this moment, what we see more and more is that perception that it's more clear to go to the US market, and therefore organizations tend to first put their products on the US market and then afterwards go to the EU market. So that is what is the perception. I don't know if we have the result of the poll already.
Hi, Anne.
So, yes.
So 66% of the respondents believe that it's more difficult in the EU. 9%
Yes.
think it's more difficult in the US, and 25% believe that it's equally difficult in both.
Yeah, so that kind of confirms that general feeling that what we see as well within our customer base, for example, where at least there is this perception, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, that the EU at this moment is more challenging than the US. So let's delve into what are the pathways to get a product to the US market and the EU market. What are the similarities, and what are the differences? I'm going to start by stating something very obvious, but what is quite commonly overlooked. The US is one country with one legislation and one language, one set of requirements, while the EU is actually a political and economical vehicle for 27 countries. And you have regulations on the EU level, but then you also still have national legislations. You have different languages, you have different requirements that can come from national legislations on top of what is defined on EU level. So there are different regulations, there are different legislations, but they still share common objectives. The ultimate goal of legislators is, when it comes to medical devices, is to bring safe and performant devices to the market. The goal is to give a framework to which manufacturers need to comply, to set the standards as well, and to make sure that there is that framework to provide qualitative products and to build trust and reliability when it comes to the products that can enter the market. So in the US, you have one legislation covering medical devices, amongst others. And then you have in the EU actually two regulations at this moment, the MDR, Medical Device Regulation, and the IVDR, the In Vitro Diagnostics Regulation. Put the references here. That is the situation since 2017. Before, we had actually 3 directives that then still needed to be translated into national legislation. So here is already a first difference. We have 1 legislation versus 2, but the objectives are still the same. Now, having said that, we have different legislations, which is normal, but to go to the very basis of this webinar, of bringing medical devices to a market is that you have to realize that the definition of a medical device is not harmonized over the world. The US has a different definition of what is a medical device than Europe, and Europe having two regulations, one for medical devices, one for in vitro diagnostics, actually has two definitions. Not going to put the definitions on the slides, you can easily find them back. What is true is that most products that are considered to be a medical device in one region will also be a medical device in the other region. Again, noting that for the US, the legislation covers both medical devices and in vitro diagnostics, while in Europe we have two different regulations for that. But even there, what is a medical device in one is probably going to be a medical device in the other, but that's not always true. One example are veterinary products. Veterinary products are within scope of medical devices in the US. It's part of the definition, while it's excluded from the definition of medical devices in Europe. In Europe, the definition of a medical device only focuses on products for human use. And so there, all veterinary products are excluded. There used to be a directive in Europe on veterinary products, but that has been repealed in 2008 already, has never been replaced. So at this moment, medical devices that are for veterinary use only are considered to be consumer goods. That's one very clear example of the differences, but there are more subtle differences as well. So it's really important when you are starting this exercise that you look at the definition, look at the intended use and the claims that are linked to your device, and this is you as a manufacturer that decides this, and then see, does my product fit within the scope, within the definition of a medical device or an in vitro diagnostic in both regions, or should we already consider different kinds of legislations to start with? For the rest of this webinar, I'm only focusing on medical devices and in vitro diagnostics, so we assume that they are within scope of the definition already of what is considered to be a medical device and an in vitro diagnostic. The next step is looking at the regulatory pathways. Now, regulatory pathways in the US and in the EU, and actually in many different regions of the world, are based on risks. As I said, the ultimate goal is to bring safe and performant devices to a market, whether it's US or Europe. That's the common objective. So they take a risk-based approach. They are going to make a classification based on, again, the intended use of the product. So, but there are specific pathways that are linked to the region itself. When we look at the US, you have FDA clearance or approval. So you have different classes, class 1, 2, 3. Class 1 being the lowest risk devices, class 3 being the highest risk devices. And linked to those classifications, you have different pathways that can apply. For class 1 products, so being the lowest class products, you have quite a lot of exemptions that are possible, but it's not all, because it's a class 1, that it's exempt by default. You can also have 510K clearances or de novo classifications. 510K means that there is already a predicate device on the market, so, and you can show that your device is similar to that device that is already on the market. De novo is when there is no predicate device. For class 2 devices, it's more likely that you have to go through a 510K clearance or a de novo, but there are also still exemptions possible. For class 3, we are talking about no longer a clearance, but a pre-market approval. So that is the most strict and most extensive regulatory approval pathway when we talk about the US. This approval in the US is governed by FDA. That's the competent authority when we talk about the US market. That's already a difference when we compare it to the European market. European market, there you have the CE marking, which is central. CE marking means that a manufacturer puts the CE mark on the device. It's a manufacturer that takes that responsibility of confirming, claiming that the device is compliant with the applicable European regulation. And there we have, again, a classification. Here we're talking, when we are talking about medical devices, about class 1. We have some subdivisions under class 1, 2A, 2B, 3. Again, 1 being the lowest risk device, 3 being the highest risk device. When it comes to in vitro diagnostics, it's A, B, C, D. A being the lowest risk device, D being the highest risk device. One major difference is that it's not one competent authority that oversees all medical devices and IVDs. In Europe, we're talking about notified bodies. Notified bodies are independent organizations. They are accredited to do so, but they are not government bodies that are doing this task. That is already a big difference. You also have more than one notified body. You have many different notified bodies that have their own accreditation, their own specialty, their own field of expertise where they can actually do the review of your file and grant you a CE mark if that is needed. For class 1 devices that are not sterile, do not have a measuring function, and are not reusable surgical instruments, manufacturers can do a self-declaration without a notified body involvement, bring it to the market. They still need to notify their competent authority, and they might still get questions afterwards, but they can bring that device to the market without prior approval. As soon as a notified body involvement is required, you first need to have that approval before you can bring the device to the market. Also here, the requirements increase, the time to market will increase with the risks that are associated to the device. It's not because your device is a class 1 in one market that it's automatically a class 1 in the other market. I will give you one example, a surgical lamp. So when you have a surgical procedure, the lamp that provides light to do so. In the US, it's considered to be a class 2 device. In Europe, it's considered to be a class 1 device. But in the US, as I mentioned before, some class 2 devices also have exemptions granted. And this is one example of a device that, even if it's class 2, is exempt from FDA oversight. So that means that you can bring that device to the market without prior clearance. That's a whole exercise that you need to do as soon as possible, because the requirements that are put on the technical documentation that you need to generate are depending on the regulatory pathway that you will take on the classification. So it's really needed to know upfront, where does my device fit in, to know what are the requirements in terms of approvals, in terms of technical documentation, and in terms of defining a plan that is needed to actually bring that device to the market. So that brings us to the regulatory strategies. So it's important to think about regulatory strategies, especially, it's always important to think about regulatory strategy, but especially if you're going to target multiple markets, it's really key to define what is important, when to target which market. Do we want to do it in parallel? Do we want to do it one after the other? what are the different requirements and how are we going to approach this? So it's really important to start early. Regulatory requirements also have an input in the design. So when you're going to start thinking about regulatory requirements after your design phase, you will have delays anyway, because it will give you input there. It will change requirements, not only in terms of packaging, because that is very easy difference to see. The different packaging requirements in terms of languages, in terms of symbols, in terms of UDI, unique device identification. That is one thing, but also in some cases, you might have different standards that you need to comply with that actually give you differences in design of your product itself. So it's really important to integrate regulatory requirements into your product development plan in order not to face delays there. So start early and start thinking about those different markets already. Also apply a comprehensive approach. What I mean with that is consider the different markets, think about that classification, think about other requirements as well. Risk management. Risk management is something that is mandatory for all markets. As I said, they take a risk-based approach. The ultimate goal is to bring safe and performant devices to a market. So risk management is a common requirement, but look at what if there are no differences. I will come back to risk management just a little bit later. But you have ISO 14097, which is a basis, but there could be other requirements coming on top of that. There is also a need for a quality management system. Depending on the classification, and again, that could be different in the different regions, you might have more extensive quality management system that is required or only a limited set of procedures. When it comes to post-market surveillance, trend reporting, also here you might have differences. So it's important to think about it, document it, make the gap analysis between the two, knowing the similarities, but also the differences, and make sure that both your quality management system as well as your documentation when it comes to the product itself are adapted to those differences. I've been talking about regulatory requirements. We're thinking about a regulatory strategy. Do not only focus on the MDR, the IVDR, the US legislation when it comes to medical devices, but also think about other applicable legislations that are linked to those regions. For example, GDPR in Europe for protection of personal data, but we have HIPAA in the US. These other regulations are equally important. You have to comply to them when you bring your product to the market, and for example, when you're processing health data, personal data. And it's important to know about these regulations, but also to see what are the differences, what is required for each territory, what do we have to take into account. Not only regulations are important, also the guidelines, the standards, and they might actually provide you with much more clear information of what is applicable to you, what you have to take into consideration. Documentation requirements. Are there specific templates that you need to use, for example, for reporting? What are the differences again, and what are the similarities? Mentioned before risk management, I just want to come back to it quickly in the sense that risk management is important. It's a common requirement, not only for US and EU, but in all regulated areas. So you have to consider risk management For medical devices, we have the ISO 14971, which is harmonized, which is recognized, which is a consensus standard. That is not a problem, but you also have to monitor other standards that might actually give you additional requirements when it comes to risks. So when we think about usability engineering, but also now in Europe, but also in the US, it's a hot topic, AI, artificial intelligence. When that is part of your product, you see now many more requirements coming from standards, but in Europe, you also have the AI Act that is coming up that will give you additional requirements when it comes to risk management and also other aspects of your product. So again, it's really important to monitor what is going on in that region on a regulatory front, in the regulatory landscape, not only focusing on medical devices as such, but also looking at the bigger picture. Next to risk management on product level, it's also important to consider business risks in the overall project management. What I mean with that is, if you are going for US clearance, bringing your product to the US market first, and I face delays, does that have an impact on anything else in my regulatory plan? Some countries depend on US approval or CE marking, and depending on what is the bigger picture, you also need to take into account that delays on one front might have a bigger impact than in the other territory, and that should also be part of that regulatory strategy. It's super complex sometimes to navigate these regulatory landscapes, especially when you're dealing with multiple territories. Started by saying there are already differences in the definition, and along the way there are more differences in the regulatory pathways, in the specific requirements, and so on. If you have the chance to engage with regulatory authorities to seek guidance, that's a very good thing to consider, because if you have direct information, for example, in the US, you have this possibility to start a procedure to have guidance from FDA. If you have direct information from them on your specific file, that will help you much more than trying to be compliant, submitting, and then afterwards receiving the questions. In Europe, it's a little bit more difficult with notified bodies to have actual guidance because they cannot take any consultancy, and some are more strict than others in that, but it's more difficult to get the chance to really ask questions about your specific case and get feedback. But you can still, at the start of your project, get in touch with them and try to get feedback on specific things. They might not go into full details because they cannot, but they can still give you a direction to tell you whether or not you're on the right track. That being said, the development of medical devices can take many years. And in the meantime, the regulatory landscape can change. It's a dynamic thing. It never changes. It never stays the same. It always changes. The markets are dynamic, but also your organization and the business opportunities are dynamic. So everything can change, and you need to be prepared to adapt. So a regulatory strategy, when you build it at the start of your project, will likely not be the same as where you end when you're ready to submit. But that's fine. What you need to do is to find a way to have a system to document everything that is needed, but a system that is also flexible, that allows you to make changes in an efficient way, that allows your organization to evolve, and that works with your organization and your goals of your organization and not against it. So we have been talking about the differences and similarities in legislations, it's clear that we need to have a strategy, but what we also should think about is how to do that in the most efficient way, how to avoid double work. And I'm highlighting a few of the key tactics here. First one is to focus on the harmonized, the recognized, the consensus standards. Why would you focus on those? Well, first of all, they give presumption of conformity. When you comply to harmonized or consensus standards, they are accepted as being a good way to perform whatever the standard is about. When we talk, for example, about risk management, again, ISO 14971 is a harmonized standard, is a consensus standard. So when you do risk management according to that standard, that's accepted to be a good way to do so. 62366-1, which is about usability engineering, is harmonized, is accepted. So that actually gives you a good framework that is accepted in both regions ideally, but that's quite easy to look up if what are the harmonized standards and what are the consensus standards, so to merge them. But if there are overlapping standards there, that's actually an easy way to already reduce work, because if they are accepted in both regions, you can implement the requirements of those standards and you're good for those two regions for this specific topic. So it's a way to streamline efforts, to avoid double work, but also to avoid mistakes there. Focusing again on risk management, but it's super important and it's really the basis of a lot of the documentation. It's a shared requirements. So looking at ISO 14971, implementing it correctly will give you a very good baseline to build a compliant risk management file. Next thing would be to look at documentation and templates. I would advise any company that wants to target multiple regions to try building templates, especially on the procedural level, that can fit both or more the requirements for both or more. So if you have a procedure, for example, for complaint handling, if there are specific requirements for the different regions when it comes to complaint handling or reporting afterwards when there would be an incident or anything else, you still can have one procedure that mentions the two and then have specific templates when it comes to really the reporting, because both regions have their own template that you need to use when it comes to reporting. You can still describe the timelines for reporting in this one procedure, and it actually makes it easy to find back all the information in one procedure and then divert to specific work instructions, specific templates. But when you have templates, it makes life easy. You know where to go to, you know that it has been approved, you know that it's compliant, and you can use them. And that is actually big help, because if you have, let's say, parallel procedures, you sometimes lose the oversight, and it's more difficult to make sure that everything is done according to the requirements of a specific region. So my personal suggestion would be to make as much as possible procedures that cover the different requirements of all the regions, and then have specific work instructions and specific templates to create records if that would be needed, if they are different. Of course, if the requirements are the same and you can use the same template for both regions, that makes life much easier, and you should do that. Again, also when you would make changes or when you would have to make changes, avoid double work if you have a template that fits more than one region. And then the last point I want to raise to avoid double work is using compliance tools. What I mean by that is, if you have the possibility to use tools that enhance collaboration, that let teams focus on the content rather than building zillions of copies of the same kind of documentation, that will increase your organizational efficiency. Of course, I mean, I'm working for Matrix Requirements. This is an example of a tool that does that, where you can build your, let's say, your requirements for your product, do your risk management and so on, and extract the documentation as it's needed for your different submissions. But that is actually the aim of our tool, but there are also other tools where you let organizations focus on content and then extract the documents that are required for submission in the format that they need to have for those submissions, but without creating double work of having to go over that same process again and again of extract or of creating documents for the specific region. So if you have a tool that facilitates that, that will definitely help. That's always helpful, but especially when you're targeting multiple regions, there you can really benefit of having a compliance tool to support the regulatory efforts. So that being said, I just want to summarize what we have been talking about. So first of all, what I think is super important is to understand your product, understand truly the intended use and the claims you want to make, and what is the impact on the regulatory pathway. In which legislation do you fit? What classification? What are my requirements? What are the similarities between the regions? And what are the differences? Then afterwards, we should create a regulatory strategy. We have to plan. So looking at the different regions that you want to target, but also the priority there and the impact on the bigger picture. So the business objectives, what are the dependencies on my US approval and on my CE marking for other markets that I want to enter. Try to be as efficient as possible, avoid double work, look at those similarities, make use of them, try to reduce duplication as much as possible, not only because of the fact it's less efficient if you duplicate, but also it's much more prone to error. You have much more chance of making mistakes when you have duplicate information and you have to find it back everywhere. And then the last point is remain flexible. Everything can change and you need to be ready to adapt to those changes. So with that, I want to thank everybody and I'm happy to answer questions.
Great, Anne, thank you. I hope you're ready because we've got actually quite a few questions that have come in. And so let's just, without any further delay, just kind of jump into this. Let me, and they're, pardon the pun, but they kind of are all over the map. So I'm just going to kind of start with the top and work our way down. Can you please advise us on what is the difference for EU common specification and US?
Well, the common specifications are there. Well, if we're talking, tell me if I misunderstood the question. But in the EU, the common specifications are there when there are no standards, no harmonized standards for a specific product, for example. So there, EU legislators have the freedom to add common specifications when they feel that there is a need to put additional requirements for certain products. So these are not standards. This will become part of the legislation, but this is it's up to the legislators to decide on this. So that means that not for all products there will be common specifications there. While it's also a different process, let's say, to get it approved. One needs to go to the whole legislative process, although it goes faster, while the standards go through technical committees, and that's the same. I mean, standards are those technical committees are globally.
Okay.
So yeah, sorry. So that is in Europe how these common specifications would work. In US, I am less familiar with how the approval process goes, but also there you can have common specifications to, well, to actually have additional requirements for products.
Okay. You know, we talked about a regulatory pathway and strategy. Is there a template that is out there that could act as sort of the roadmap that people could fill in?
Oh, for
Regulatory strategy.
for a complete regulatory strategy, it's difficult to have one template. What you can find online is let's say the requirements and the timelines, but these are estimations, of course, for bringing devices to both markets, but this is not fixed. So when planning, you really need to think about what are the goals for your organization. If we are focusing on EU first, then look at those requirements. And then when we think about bringing a product to the EU market, you have to take into consideration at this moment, it used to be worse, it's improving, but that notified bodies have been faced with many new challenges. There are less notified bodies, they have more customers, they are private organizations, so timelines there have really increased before they can actually look at your file. That's why actually there is a shift in Europe with European organizations that to bring products first to the US market, because there at least the timelines are more clear at this moment. Not sure that that fully answers the question, because it's difficult to have one template. There are so many variables you have to take into consideration. Medical devices are very, very broad field of devices, and it also really depends on your product. What kind of device are you trying to bring to the market? What kind of classification does your device have? What are the requirements in terms of testing? Because a lot of work also and a lot of time and resources go into lab tests, clinical evaluation, making sure that you have all the clinical data to create your, let's call it a medical device file, a technical file in Europe, design history file in US. So
I'm going to move on to the next question just for sake of time, because actually they continue to come in. So we've got a very active audience here. But, and I'm almost hesitant to read this one, because I think this is probably the topic of an entirely second follow-up webinar. But
okay.
the UK market, the Swiss market, when you talk about EU and versus the United States, where does UK and Switzerland come into play in terms of strategy?
Well, it's actually a very interesting question. Let's talk about Switzerland first. Switzerland had a bilateral agreement with Europe during the MDD, the Medical Device Directive period. When MDR came into play in 2017, that agreement was not prolonged. So that means that Switzerland was all of a sudden a third country when you look from a European perspective. So they made their own requirements for bringing medical devices to the Swiss market. So you need to have a Swiss representative as well to talk to the authorities. But what is interesting is during the time where the bilateral agreement was still in place, the CE marking was accepted. So you needed to have a CE mark a CE mark device in order to bring a device to the Swiss market. Now they're opening the door for devices that are only approved in the US and do not carry the CE mark. So when we think about the regulatory strategy, if you are a you have a US approved or cleared device, and you're only interested in the Swiss market, well, you have your way in. You don't need to go through CE marking anymore just to get to this, or just to be able to enter the Swiss market. When we think about the UK, okay, so they used to be part of Europe. Brexit came, so they're out of Europe. They have their own legislation. They have their own procedure now. So far, CE mark devices are still accepted, but in the future, you will have to have the UK certification to enter the US market, the UK market. So there we also see that shift. When we compare that, for example, with Turkey at this moment, they also used to have this agreement with Europe, and that has been renewed. So there, the CE marking is still accepted to enter the Turkish market.
Okay, very good. Moving on to labeling of software. What are the requirements for labeling of the software user interface used with medical devices in the US and in the EU? Is the user interface considered like medical device label, or does the IFU suffice for labeling of the software user interface?
Well, your user interface is part of your medical device. So it depends on how you bring your device to your customers, on what you need to do. In the case that you only, for example, with an app, you don't have a manual that is provided with your app necessarily, but it can be a medical device. So there, it really needs to be part of the user interface, and you need to have a way of showing all the required parts that need to be otherwise on a manual or on a packaging if you would not have a software product. So it really depends on what how your product is delivered.
Okay. Now we're moving on to the topic of human factors. Do human factors studies done in the US, are they accepted by notified bodies in Europe, and vice versa? Is human factor studies in Europe for CE accepted by the FDA for a 510K clearance?
That's a good question. It depends on That's generally the answer to most questions. It depends, but it depends on what you are trying to demonstrate with your study. If the users, the user group, the user population that is included in your study is similar between both regions, and there is nothing that would differentiate and that is important for the conclusion of your study, then they might accept it. But again, it will depend a lot on what you're trying to demonstrate. And one big difference is already language. I mean, if you are going to bring a device to the market to use human factor or usability engineering, language becomes a very important thing. So if that is different, you really need to show that the information that is given, the setup, the conditions are very similar, and then you might try to have that accepted. But there is also one point where I would advise to seek guidance upfront if they would accept it in the framework of your study of what you are trying to show or not.
Okay. All right, moving on. The MDD has been extended to May 2028. Does that mean that we have to comply with the harmonized MDR standards by the deadline of May 2024, or has that too been extended to May 2028?
Well, first of all, it's important to point out that this is only for legacy devices. So if you're bringing new devices to the European market, you have to comply with the MDR. There is no MDD anymore. So this is only for legacy devices that were already on the market, or if you have a commitment and you can prove that you have already started the process of becoming MDR compliant. So that is one important note there. When it comes to being compliant with MDD and MDR requirements, also the MDD says that you need to comply with state of the art. My suggestion would be to go for newer versions of standards if they have been released. That was also already a bit the case before. You know, when you're focusing on US and EU markets, the harmonized standards in Europe tended to be behind in versioning compared to what is recognized in the US. If you have to choose, go for the highest version of the standard. The MDR will not harmonize, I mean, there will not come harmonized standards to a lower version of a standard than what is published at the moment. You could try to negotiate with your notified body to sticking with the current version of the standard, but you have to realize that there is, I mean, there is no turning back. We are moving forward. You have to go for MDR compliance if you want to keep your products on the market. So it's better to actually already adapt to newer versions of the standard rather than sticking to old versions, if that would already be accepted. Because in my experience, when I was in audits, when I had technical files being reviewed, it's actually accepted to go for newer versions of standards rather than sticking to old ones.
Okay. All right. Moving on to a couple of topics that are pretty much in the headlines all the time now. What are some of the key differences between EU MDR and the FDA guidance with relationship to cybersecurity and the usage of AI?
Whew.
That is another, probably another webinar.
That I would think is another subject. Well, in Europe, we have now we have the AI Act coming. Normally, the final vote will be in April of this year. And so we will have our own framework when it comes to AI. When it comes to cybersecurity, I would, from what I've seen and what we see that organizations are focusing on, I would at this moment include the NIST framework. We have a similar framework, but it's really very similar in Europe. So there, I don't see a big issue if you comply with the NIST framework. That is that should be accepted here in Europe as well. When it comes to AI, it's still very unclear because this AI Act is a new legislation that is coming in Europe, but it's not focusing on medical devices per se. So we're still waiting for medical device specific guidances, standards. We have to see what will be harmonized under the AI Act when it comes to the use of AI and which standards will be harmonized. This moment, there are still big discussions going on in Europe in terms of management systems that would need to be in place. What we do know is that when you have a CE mark device, that will also include compliance with the AI Act. So there won't be two regulatory approvals. It will be combined in one. Your notified body will have to take care of both, let's say, compliance with NDR and then the additional requirements when it comes to AI in Europe. But other than that, it's a process that is in flux at the moment. We really have to see what specific requirements will come. Medical devices will be considered to be high-risk devices under the AI Act, so we'll have to comply to all the requirements. But I think if we want to go into details there, that should be a separate webinar.
Okay, I think that's a big topic, and I would agree. If you have some time, we still have plenty of other questions coming in.
Yeah, we
all
can
right.
still answer a few.
This is going up, bringing up the topic of Canada. So what is the main difference between a medical device manufacturer in Canada, the US, and the EU? For example, does having a product license in Canada make you a manufacturer in the US and in the EU? I'll read that again. Does having a product license in Canada make you a manufacturer in the US and in the EU?
I'm going to be very honest. I'm not specialized in Canada, so I'm not 100% sure. But what you have to take into account is that when you bring a product, it's interesting because you would have to really look at how a manufacturer in Canada is defined compared to EU and US. In Europe, you're very quickly considered to be a legal manufacturer of a medical device. So whenever you make a change, whenever you make changes to the labeling and so on, you are at risk of becoming a manufacturer of a medical device when it comes to Europe. I'm not 100% sure of the exact definition in Canada, so I'd rather not make a mistake there and keep that answer open at the moment. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. This is also another probably big topic. And also, before we move on to that question, to the last question, does the next slide have your contact details?
No, but we can add them.
Yeah, so we'll while we're going through some of these other questions, we'll put Anne's contact, her email address up on the screen so that anybody who either would like to follow up with additional questions can go directly to Anne. And if she doesn't have the answer right away, she'll go into her internal resources and get some help. So while we're doing that, let's move on to the next question. Do you have specific recommendations for digital medical devices versus classical medical devices? Meaning, a classical medical device has no IT, and a digital one could be something as having AI as a component. So it's not medical device as a software as much as a medical device with technology, digital technology, versus a medical device without technology, without digital technology. So is there any specific recommendations for strategy for, or do both of those fall within the same guidelines for your regulatory strategy? And we lost you lost your audio. No, still lost your audio.
But of course, you have specific things that apply for software. When you look at the MDR, for example, you have specific general safety and performance requirements for software. You have one that is specifically directed towards software, and software is actually included a bit everywhere, including as well cybersecurity requirements and so on. Also for US, I mean, software can be a medical device. First thing, and that's the same for all devices, is what is my intended use? What are my claims? Do they fit within this legislation? Is it a software? Is it a medical device? Once we know that, then you have to create the documentation that is required depending on the classification of your software in this case. There are specific standards about the life cycle of software, standalone software or software integrated in a medical device. So for example, IEC 82304 is one to look at when you have a standalone software. Also, when we are talking about software with an AI component. When we look at AI components themselves, you have already some standards that are focusing specifically on AI. For example, you have and now I have to really make sure that I say it correctly, the ISO 34971, which is, for example, a standard about implementing 14971, so risk management, for devices with machine learning. So there you have a standard that gives you guidance on how to apply ISO 14971 when you have a AI that is based on machine learning. You have other standards as well. 42001 is one about management systems when it comes to AI development, not focused specifically on medical devices. So there you would have to see how does that fit with 13485, with my QMS, with Part 820, where are the similarities, where are the differences, what is the gap that I need to fill. Other standards exist as well. 23894 is another one about risk management for AI developers. So that takes it a little bit more high level. It's not the same as 14971. It actually has already very specific differences in what is considered to be a risk and what to work on. But also there you will have to see, okay, does this apply and how can I integrate it in what I already have, if you already have documentation, if you already have processes, and what is the gap that I need to fill in them. And in the most efficient way. This comes back to also making those templates. Once you do the gap analysis, once you know what is the difference, you can also look at what do I have in terms of templates and where do my templates need to be changed, or if really needed, do I need to create additional templates? So those aspects are changing quite rapidly at the moment when it comes to software with an AI component. And it's really something to monitor and see how it evolves, to really know which requirements are applicable to me, which standards are applicable to me, and how can I do this in the most efficient way? How can I adapt what I have in the most efficient way?
Okay. We are running over. We have several questions, but I think this one might warrant us just spending a little bit more time. In the US, some devices have class 1 and class 2 designations, even though they seem to describe the same product. For example, liquid crystal thermometer can be a class 1 or a class 2. How do we decide which one to choose?
Well, then that's a good question. Then you really have to look at your predicate devices and see where are the differences, if and where, I mean, to which product does your product relate most, and then you can decide about the classification there. If you are in doubt, again, there are procedures to seek guidance with FDA. That is the advantage that you have in the US, that there are official procedures to seek guidance, to get feedback on your specific case. In Europe, that is more difficult because you have to have a notified body that is willing to help you there. But that would be my advice, to look at what are the predicate devices, what are the differences there, and where does my device, I mean, to which one does it compare most?
Okay. Okay, very good. We've covered this already, but the PowerPoint slides will be shared with everyone. They'll be coming after the with the recording, I believe, and coming directly from Matrix requirements. And with that, we're going to conclude now, and want to thank Matrix Requirements for sponsoring this webinar, and thank you very much for your presentation and working with us. We had some great questions, and look forward to working with everyone again.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Thanks also for the interesting questions. And as mentioned, we will also provide the slides, the recording, and then you will also have our contact details. If you have further questions or you want to follow up, feel free to contact us afterwards.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Have a great day, great week.
Bye-bye. Thank you.